Welcome to our first weekly warm-up. We'll start each week by making observations about the type of landscape we'll be painting. By analyzing photos of each landscape element in detail, we'll gain a deeper understanding of how to paint each element from memory. When we're ready to create our assignment painting, we'll draw from these observations and use them to compose scenes from our imagination. During this class, we'll be following a reference image for each assignment. After this class, reference photos will be optional and you should be able to paint without having to copy a photo. It sounds really simple, but you'll make the most progress as a painter if you can take time to relax and observe nature. I do this often as a great way to get inspiration. If you happen to notice something interesting, like the color of a sunset sky, for instance, pay close attention to the details like color, form, and shape. Then when you're ready to paint, you'll be able to recall some of the details from memory without having to rely on a photo. Of course, most of us don't exactly have a photographic memory, but a little bit of artistic interpretation certainly doesn't hurt the value of your artwork. Memorizing a specific color is easy if you can break it down into its fundamental properties. Color on a computer differs from color made with traditional media. In the computer world, color is additive and can be measured by its HSV properties. HSV stands for hue, saturation, and value. And you'll find these on your color wheel. You'll want to make sure your color wheel is set to HSV instead of RGB. And the hue is this ring here, and your saturation and value are located within this triangle. So on the horizontal axis, you will find your saturation, and saturation again is intensity of color. So it's muted gray, and then as you start to add more saturation, it gets more intense, more vibrant as you go towards the end of the triangle here. On the vertical axis is your value, which is your tone, and that's your range of light to dark. So when you're picking color, the easiest thing to do is pick your hue first. Is it going to be a blue? Is it going to be a green? What kind of blue? What kind of green? Pick that first. And then is it going to be light? Is it going to be dark? Up or down here on this axis? And then is it going to be muted, gray, or is it going to be really, really bright and really vibrant? And then you'll use this axis here. So I usually do it in that order. 2 and 3 can kind of be juxtaposed. You don't have to do them in that exact order, but that's how I like to do it. Now, this HSV color is based on computer color. And in the computer world, as I mentioned, additive color is the dominant form of color. So red, green, and blue light combine to make light or white color. When you're working with print or traditional media like paint, you're using subtractive color. And so these lighter colors combine to make dark. It's kind of the opposite. And what's interesting here is you'll note that we have cyan, magenta, and yellow, which make black. And you may know that as CMYK color. And then we have red, green, and blue, which make RGB color. Now, within the RGB color model, we have yellow and cyan and magenta. And then within the subtractive color, we have green, red, and blue, where these overlap. So these two color models are interrelated. You kind of want to think of this color wheel as being more than just a way to pick color. It's a way to really scientifically understand color, because what you have here is you have a nice color wheel. So if you want to get into color theory a little bit, you can watch one of my reference videos, but your complementary colors are opposite each other on the color wheel. So having a little bit of an understanding of the terminology and the basic properties of color, I think will be helpful as you work through this class. As we create our assignment paintings, we'll be paying close attention to the hue, saturation, and value when we're choosing colors. Experiment with the HSV sliders until you're comfortable picking a color. You can also use the triangle and really just pick a color any way you want in any order, but just remember that there are these 3 different properties: the value, the saturation, and the hue. And you'll see that when you move each of these components, these slider bars move. So this will give you a good idea of exactly what color you're going to get. You should be able to pick color more accurately rather than guessing. The dropper tool is helpful for sampling colors if you want to find a specific color in one of your reference photos, or even while you're painting. So we'll take the dropper tool here and we'll just tap on a color, and you can see over here it's picked this green. If I want, let's say, one of these shades from in this saturation down here, I can pick this. Pick one of these grays so you can really get a very specific color. Although when you get to areas like this where colors are very close to each other, if you tap and you hold and you drag, you can see how the picker here changes when you move from one color to another. And I'll give you an idea of how transitions happen too, because transitions are very important when you're shading. All right, let's get down to business and start making some observations. We're going to use our dropper tool to sample some colors on these different images. And again, as I mentioned, you'll want to acquire your own images. Just try to find something similar to what I have. And it really doesn't have to be this specific image, but just some different kinds of skies. I have a daylight sky and a sunset and kind of early morning and dusk and a little bit of everything. And if we tap and we drag with our dropper and we watch in our color picker here, we'll see that these HSV sliders all kind of move independently. And there's kind of a logic to these colors here. If we sample near the sun, near our light source where our colors are brighter, our color is going to be more saturated. It's going to be more intense. And as we move away, that saturation starts to decrease gradually. There's a transition there in saturation. It's a less intense color up here. It also becomes darker in value. The hue changes as well. The hue goes from orange, swings all the way around to blue, and you can see it doesn't jump anywhere. It makes a smooth transition there. So these transitions happen naturally a lot, and you need to be really aware of these. These transitions in color are known as gradients, and there's lots of different kinds of gradients. Besides color gradients, there's also focal gradients. And gradients are kind of like a sloping hill. They start out kind of level, and then they start to get steeper gradually. The color changes over a distance. And this change in color and the distance that it takes for the color to change, whether it's slowly or rapidly, begins to kind of convey a distance, visual distance in your landscape, or lighting or three-dimensional form, or even all three combined. And in this example here, all I really did was just draw a hill shape, and then I made it lighter on the top and darker on the bottom. And by adding this biker in, it kind of put it in context, but you get the impression that there's light that's brighter over here. There's also a slope that happens in the hill, not necessarily a two-dimensional slope, but a three-dimensional slope. And then there's a color gradient, which also just kind of helps further establish both of those things. And you really get the impression that there's some life and some realism going on here just because of this gradient. And these gradients are going to get used a lot everywhere when you're working on landscape painting. So they're a very important thing to get comfortable with using. Let's take a more in-depth look at shifting the hue. Now, as we observed earlier, in the sky, the hue does shift a little bit from indigo towards cyan as we near the horizon. And in some cases, like this dusk image here, it goes from cyan, and then it goes the other way towards orange and yellow over here. So you can really get a pretty wide range of colors, but the important thing to remember is that these transitions happen often, especially in the sky. This is because our atmosphere changes at different altitudes, which varies the wavelength of the light we see in the sky. To fully understand color, you must understand light. Light is made from photons, which travel in wavelengths. Light can interact with matter by reflecting off of it or passing through it, and these interactions cause the wavelength of light to change, which in turn changes the color of the light we see. When you're mixing colors lighter or darker, it's essential to shift the hue of the color rather than only add or subtract value in saturation. A hue shift can really make your landscape colors look more dramatic. In this example here, the sky on the left does not utilize a hue shift, and it's kind of monochromatic, which is fine if that's the style that you're going for, but if you want a little more vibrance, you'll use a little bit of hue shift. And up here at the top, it's more indigo, and down here at the bottom, it's more cyan. You can see that transition happens. Pretty drastic shift. So this is something that you can use in your paintings. I definitely want to see you try this. So now that we've learned about color, we can move on to the next step, which will be shape and form. And we'll take a look at specific objects like clouds and skies, and I'll explain how they're formed and how to shade them, and that'll give us some insight into how to do things later when we create our assignment painting. Skies come in a wide range of colors and can vary depending on location, time of day, weather, and season. Man-made influences such as electric light and pollution may also influence the color of a sky. Skies are often the primary environment color when outdoors, so they are often the best place to start when composing a landscape. A horizon is created when the sky is overlapped by the land. If the horizon is very distant, it's often very straight and horizontal. As you can see in this example here, the only exception is this hill that kind of starts to go above the horizon. The sun varies in size and color depending on the time of day. The center of the sun is often a white or bright warm color. A warm corona or halo often surrounds the sun and other light sources. Light rays and lens flares of all colors may emanate from the light source as well. The sun, moon, and other light sources reflect their light off of the sky. If your light source is visible in your composition, your sky and everything else in your painting should be brighter near your light source. Likewise, objects which are far from the light source should be darker. To get a better idea of how light works on a 2D surface, such as the sky, we can use this little lighting tool here. And the way that we find this is we go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Lighting. And you want to make sure that you have just a new blank canvas open. And what you'll get is this kind of imaginary light here. This could be the sun, it could be a light bulb, it could be pretty much any light source. You can have multiple light sources. If you tap somewhere else, you'll create a second light. And you probably don't want to do that at first because it's just going to kind of ruin everything. So if you end up creating additional lights that you don't want, just hit delete on your keyboard and it'll go away. And you'll want to tap and drag from the center of this white dot to move your light, and then release to place it. Now, if you think of this as a sun or a light bulb, you can control all the properties of this light. You can control the brightness, the distance that the light is, so you can make it look more like a sun if you want to get a feel for how a sun's going to work. But you can see it has this nice gradient. And this time, rather than being a linear gradient, it's a radial gradient on top of a two-dimensional surface. So play around with this a little bit. You can change the color of the light and the ambient color, which is the halo that's surrounding the light. And then you can get a good feel for how this is going to work. This is kind of what you're going for when you're doing a sun in the sky. If you were doing something a little more like a sky where there's not the sun showing, you would probably want something, maybe more like this, or maybe a horizontal gradient. Clouds vary drastically in size, shape, and color. How you paint clouds depends on the weather, time of day, geographic location, and season in your composition. Cloud shapes vary depending on their altitude as well. Though they appear to take seemingly random shapes, clouds are made of a simple repeating pattern known as a fractal. Fractals are self-similar, which means the edges of a cloud look similar whether they are viewed up close or from far away. Now, when we want to start shading these clouds and any other object in our painting, we're going to need to know the three basic principles of shading, and those are highlights, shadows, and midtones. So in this bottom example here, the highlights would be this really bright white area, and the shadows would be these darker areas underneath the clouds. The midtones would be values that are kind of in the middle, maybe like that, or even the sky would be a midtone. So for your highlights, you'll want to think about where your light source is, and where your light source is closest to your object, you're going to want to make it that the brightest area. So you can see on these clouds here, the sun's kind of central to them, and so it's lighting them kind of from all sides. The shadow ends up being kind of down the center, because this is the part that's being blocked. This is kind of in front of the sun. And this example here in the top, we're kind of looking at the cloud straight on, so we only see the underside of the cloud here, and then the top side's here. The light's coming down from a point where we can't see. In this example here on the bottom, it's clear where the light is. It's coming straight down and it's hitting the top of the clouds. And then we're seeing this underneath area here from underneath the clouds where the light's being blocked. So we know what to do with the highlights. Those are typically going to be really bright colors that are saturated. The shadows are going to be kind of the opposite. The shadows are going to be on the opposite side where the light isn't going to be able to reach. And those shadows are going to typically be cooler colors. If we look at this example here, this area underneath the cloud is kind of if we sample it here and we look, it's kind of a blue-gray. And it's not too far off from the hue that's in our sky here and on our ground. So really what it's doing is the light is coming out of the sky. We use a different color that we can see. The light's coming out of the sky. It's bouncing off the ground, maybe hitting this blue color, and then it's going up here and it's hitting the underside of the cloud, because the light that's coming here and it's hitting the top of the cloud, that's reflecting back as white. This light down here is reflecting back to us from some of the sky color and some of the surrounding environment colors that are reflecting off of it. So when you're picking the underneath of a cloud, and although it all looks kind of gray, it's actually gray and blue and yellow and some other different colors. If you sample it, you'll see that it's not always the color that you think it is. Here are some examples I made of different areas that I consider to be prime areas for highlights and shadows and midtones. And it just kind of points out some different places to hunt for color. So we'll look at the first example here, and this will be the highlight and shadow areas. In your color picker here, your highlights are usually pretty bright, so they're kind of around this area here, kind of hugging this top ceiling of your triangle here. Your shadows are usually down here in this little pit, and they're usually more desaturated and darker, and then everything else in the middle is kind of a midtone. Your saturation intensity is following the rightmost edge of your color picker, your triangle here. So this is the most saturated color. So you kind of want to hug this edge when you're trying to saturate your colors, and then stray away from it when you want to mute your colors. Gets a little more complex here. Now in this example, I have some different labels here, so you can kind of get an idea. If I wanted a muted dark color, I can look kind of in this area here. If I wanted a really saturated color, I could look over here. I know where to go. And to get even more complicated, this kind of gives you some context here. So if we wanted washed out highlights, for instance, these would be over here, subdued highlights here, intense highlights here, and so on. So these charts are available in the class resources for you to look at, and these should give you a good idea of how and why to pick color from here on out. We think of clouds as being white in color, but they're actually an off-white. This is often a warm color like yellow or orange, but it can also be cool or neutral. White balance is especially useful anytime you are dealing with white, black, or gray colors. Giving these colors a slight tint really helps to make your colors more realistic. The tint can be uniform or it can vary gradually. We'll just sample a few colors here. On this example, this has pretty much a cool tint to it. You can see if I sample around the light and dark areas, they're all pretty cool. If I go to this example here and I sample the highlights, they're much warmer. The amount of highlights, shadows, and midtones you use can be referred to as contrast, and the amount of contrast that an image has can make it look several different ways. So right now we have this image here that has very strong, striking contrast, and the contrast has been pumped up a little bit here, and the whites are much whiter, and the dark areas are much darker. If I reduce the contrast, you'll see that the colors all start to kind of even out a little bit, and everything kind of gets dulled down. If I go back to the other end, you can see it gets punched back up again. So it's up to you as the artist to decide how much contrast you want to use. You want there to be a good range in values from really light to really dark and everything in between. And in this particular piece, there isn't any black. There doesn't really need to be black, but there's a good contrast between this dark area and this light area. So contrast is kind of a relative thing depending on the piece. When shading, it's important to place colors correctly. Most of the time, you'll want to avoid placing dark colors on top of a light color, unless the intent is to block, tint, or obscure the light source with a solid object or haze. This is because shadows are created in the absence of light. Light destroys shadows on contact, so always keep that in mind when you're painting. For instance, we have this tree here, this silhouetted tree that's in front of our light color, and the dark being on top of the light kind of gives this effect of the light being covered up. Now, we can destroy this dark area by putting light in front of it. So I'm going to go to this light layer here, and I'm just going to put a little bit of a glow over it, and you can see when I place light over dark, the dark suddenly gets destroyed. So there's kind of a battle going on here between light and dark. If we remove the tree and we go to another layer and we use something like a softer brush and we paint some dark area in, you can see we get this effect of a kind of a haze where we're tinting. And you might want to do that. That's not necessarily wrong to do, but you have to make sure that that's what you're going for. And this really applies more to when you're doing three-dimensional shading. For instance, on this tree, if we go to put some shading on it, we'll just do the trunk here. Real quick, we'll use a nice bright color that we can all see. We can go ahead and put a highlight on here because we have a good highlight side that we're going to use. And if we go and we keep adding highlights on top of highlights, that's fine. Our tree is going to start to look three-dimensional. But if we start putting darker colors on top of our highlights, then we start to do things like poke holes in our highlights and things, and it gives a whole different effect when you put dark on top of light rather than light on top of dark. Dark on top of light kind of pushes things inward, and light on top of dark kind of pulls them outwards and towards you and makes them look like they're bulging out, collecting more light. So you have to watch out for the order that you use these colors in, and you'll probably have to experiment a little to see how that works, but I'll go into more detail about how exactly to paint trees and different objects as we move forward in this class. When light is reflected, its color can lose intensity. You can mimic this effect by reducing the saturation of the shadow color and shift the hue toward a darker color to get a more natural shading effect. For highlights, do the opposite and shift the hue towards a lighter color to add color intensity, because colors are often more vibrant near a light source. So back on this tree example here, we will take a look at that in more detail. So our shadow color could be a couple things on this tree. It would most likely be the sky and the grass, because the light's coming out of the sun and it's bouncing off of these things like the sky color and the ground color and then onto the tree, and then from the tree it bounces into our eyes. So the tree is going to have some of these environment colors. So what I like to do is I like to just sample the sky color, but we don't want to just put the sky color on there as is, because if we do, watch what's going to happen. It's just going to make the branch disappear. We want the color to mix with the branch, and we could try to just paint it on lightly, but it still gives kind of a transparent effect. What we want to do to make it look more natural is we want the color to lose intensity a little bit. So we'll just desaturate it and make it a little bit darker. And we'll shift the hue just a little bit darker. Indigo's a little bit darker than cyan. Now we'll try that same color. We'll see how it works. That works a little bit better, I think, and looks a little more natural. You don't want to gray it down too much. You don't want to darken it too much. This is really just a subtle change, but it really makes a difference in how your artwork's going to look and how natural it looks. Now, for the opposite, the highlight side, again, closer to the light means that the color is going to be more saturated. So I'm going to sample one of these tree colors. We don't really need to worry about the environment color. We're more concerned about the light source color, which we know is kind of a yellow, pale yellow here. So we'll want to incorporate some of that into our highlight. So I'm going to shift the hue a little bit towards yellow. I'm going to saturate it and brighten it in value by going up and to the right. I'm going to go just a little bit more so we can really see this. And let's try putting on some of that. You can see if we use this, it really makes the tree kind of pop. Let's brighten it a little bit more. So now you can see these highlights are really nice and vibrant and bright. And they really stand out. If we didn't use such vibrant highlights, we might not get the same effect to really feel like that light's there, like it's really interacting with the tree. Light source is very important because it determines how your object should be shaded. So lighting must be established near the beginning of the painting process. Always keep the position and angle of your light source in mind when shading to ensure that your highlights and shadows are on the correct side. So I already have illustrated my sun here, so I kind of know where it's at. And as I place these objects in, I'm going to keep in mind that the light's emanating out of the sun evenly. And so where it's coming out, it's going to hit these sides of this object, and so on. So when I start placing things around my composition here, I'm always going to want to think about where my light source is constantly when I'm shading, because if I put the highlights and shadows on the wrong side, it's going to mess everything up. It's just not going to look right. So I'm just going to hide my light rays there, and we'll go to our tree that's on the side, and I'm going to go ahead and put in my highlights on this tree and some midtones and shadows. I want to make sure that I think about where the light can reach and where it cannot. Again, as we get further into this class, we'll look a little bit more into how to shade these three-dimensional objects. Then we have our highlights on one side where they're closest. Oops, that's the wrong color. We have our highlights on one side where they're closest to light. And on the opposite side, it's where we're going to have our shadow color. And again, we can just sample some of our sky color and dull it down a little bit, and that'll work pretty well for shadow color, and just blend it up a little bit to give it some character. And we got all right looking example of a tree trunk here. So light angles, very important. If your light isn't present in your composition and you just want to indicate it somehow, if it helps, you can just draw on a separate layer a little sun or something like this that you can just turn off later. And then if it helps, draw little arrows that come out of it like I did earlier, just to kind of help you imagine the direction of that light. And then it's the same thing with your shadows. Your shadows need to move away from your light source, the angle of your light source especially. So the angle of my sun is here. My shadow is going to go away from it. To get a more dynamic look at how light interacts with 3D objects, we can check out this Apply Surface Texture panel. And it gives us this little preview here that we can make some observations on. So to get to that, you want to go to Effects, Surface Control, and then Apply Surface Texture. And just ignore this surface texture thing up here and focus down on the box down here. This works like the other little palette we were playing with earlier with the light, where you can move it around and you can get a feel for how the angle of the light is going to affect the object. And you can play around with some of these different settings to get some different brightness and different options for your sun here. And if you want to, you can add additional lights to get an idea of how reflected light would look. You could take a look at maybe a sky color reflecting here, and then now you can see what a more three-dimensional object might look like. Now, not everything is going to be spherical in shape. There's lots of other primitive shapes, and we'll get into that in just a minute here. But this kind of gives you something to play around with and make some observations. Then when you're done playing around with it, you can just click cancel, and you can try out shading in this way. So I've got a light here, and then I'm going to shade some of my spheres based on where that light is. So this is this sphere down here, so we'll make sure that the bottom's nice and dark, and we'll put a highlight area on it facing towards the light. You could even do some little reflected light on the edge to really make that stand out. Go to the next sphere, background color on it, facing away from the light source. And you can work from light to dark or dark to light, that's up to you. I just kind of chose to do it this way in this example. And highlight color. And then we'll do our third example here. And this just kind of, after a while, you'll just do this naturally. You won't have to go into any little panel and look at examples. You'll just see it in your mind and you'll make it happen. There you go. You've got some spheres that look three-dimensional. Now, it might be helpful to think of these spherical shapes as the same shape that we were looking at earlier when we were testing out how light worked on the flat plane. It kind of spanned across it in a certain way. And if you were to take this flat plane here and then just kind of squish it down into a ball, you would basically get a sphere, or if you, wrapped it around and whatnot. So it's a crude example there, but you kind of get what I'm saying. If you peel an orange peel off and then you lay it out flat, it kind of becomes a flat plane. So it goes from being 3D to 2D and vice versa. It's really just kind of, what you do with the object. But the principles are basically the same as far as how the light's going to react to it. It's still going to have a bright spot and a shadow spot. That's going to be wrapped around a sphere if it's a spherical shape, or flat if it's a flat plane, or any other shape. It may seem fundamental, but it's important to be familiar with the 5 primitive shapes: sphere, cube, cylinder, cone, and torus. You'll need to pay careful attention to their contours and memorize how their forms interact with light. All three-dimensional forms, including clouds, are made from one or more primitive shapes. Tree trunks are cylinders, rocks are spheres, and mountains are polygons. No matter what type of shape you're shading, highlight colors are always going to be nearest the light source, and shadow colors will be on the opposite side, angled away from the light. So I'll just really quickly shade all of these examples. We have a light source established here. We'll do our easy one first, which is our sphere. And so we'll add our shadow there, and we'll add our quick highlight, maybe a little bit of reflection so we can see the sphere. We'll go to the cone, and we'll add some shadow color. Now everything kind of comes to a point on the tip of this cone, so you'll want the highlight to be kind of stretched out on it, like so. And the inside of our cone, want that to be pretty dark. And we'll put a little bit of reflected light on the side of the cone too. That always helps with these kind of shapes to make it stand out. Let's do the cylinder. The cylinder is a lot like the cone. You just want to have a kind of vertical running shadow, and then a, not necessarily vertical, but a linear shadow and a linear highlight. Then do the top of the cylinder. Let's just say that this cylinder top is going to be flat. So we'll just shade it like it's a flat plane. Something like that. And let's do the cube. The cube's a little more tricky. The cube has multiple faces, so these are just several flat 2D planes that are connected together. So I have them separated in a few separate layers here. So we'll do the top first. And you want to think of each of the sides of the cube as being lighter or darker than the next, depending on how they're facing the light. So the side that's facing the light the most would be the side that you can't see, and then the top. So we'll give the top some highlight. We'll give it a little bit of shadow. And then the front is facing away from the light. Not as much as the right side, but still facing away. So we'll give it a little bit of darkness here. And then the side is facing away entirely, so that can be pretty dark, like so. And then finally we have the torus, which is kind of like a ring or a donut shape. And so you could also kind of think of it like a cylinder that's connected, its top end is connected to its bottom, so you're going to shade it like a cylinder. It's going to end up being kind of donut shaped. So we get something like this, and then we'll put a highlight on it. We have something that looks like a ring. I'm doing these kind of rough and kind of quick, but it gives you the idea of their contours and how they should look. So when we're doing these different objects now in our assignment paintings, all of these objects, mountains, trees, clouds, they're all going to be a combination of these shapes. And so you'll want to shade them appropriately based on what we've gone over here. For more examples, look around your house for objects which are shaped like each of the 5 primitive shapes. Hold them near a light source and observe how the light influences their highlights and shadows. Make note of any gradients you observe. Experiment and see how they change depending on the angle of the object and distance from the light source. 2D planes, for example, could be a sheet of paper, a coin, a wall. Something spherical would be like fruit like an orange, a ball, an egg. Cubes could be boxes, walls, your desk. Cones could be your pen tip, a horn, ice cream cone. Cylinders are tree trunks, pencils, your finger. And finally, torus would be a ring, a donut, or a rubber band. So hopefully this gives you an idea of some things you can find around the house to check out, and that will give you some more insight into shading. Objects which are near the horizon gradually become obscured by the surrounding atmosphere. This has an effect of making distant objects appear to blend with the color of the sky. Objects on different planes may appear to vary in color, often getting lighter in value as they become more distant. This effect can be leveraged to give your painting depth. See how the distant hills and mountains here appear to be different in hue and value? The one that's the most distant is much lighter than the one that's closest to the foreground, which is much darker. Use this effect in your landscape paintings to make them look more realistic. To achieve realism in your paintings, you must also paint in perspective. Perspective is very important in the composition process because it really kind of makes everything look like it really fits into the world that it's in. If you don't paint things in perspective, they're going to look kind of flat and just not realistic. Even if you do a good job of picking color and shading, if your objects aren't in perspective, it's just not going to work. So to understand perspective, I'm going to show you a little bit of a guide here that will break down our landscape into some different components. So what you're seeing right here with all these lines, this is a perspective point, and there's some different lines that help us draw in perspective. And this is a feature in Painter X3 that you can use. It's pretty handy, but when we're painting, we're not necessarily going to use this. I'm just going to use this as a visual aid to explain this. So the red line you see here, which I will enhance a little bit, this is the horizon line. And this is really the best place to start when you're making a composition and you want to make a perspective point. And what you're deciding here overall is where is the eye level of the observer going to be? And the observer is the person who's looking at the painting. Now, that's not necessarily just you when you're looking at the painting. It's the point of view represented in the painting. So when the person took this photograph, they were standing right here and taking the photo looking this direction. if they were turned a different direction, the perspective would be entirely different and the photo would look different. So this particular point of view is captured, and so is this perspective. Now, besides the horizon, there's a whole bunch of other different components, and I'll kind of put them all up here. There's going to be a light source, and in this case, the light source is just kind of, it's out of sight, but we know that it's up top because it's the sun. We have the sky. It's usually always a sky in landscape paintings. We have the land. If the land is visible, then there's land in landscape painting. There's, of course, objects that could be trees, mountains, grass, anything, pretty much anything. And we have a perspective point or a vanishing point. And then, of course, we have the observer's eye level here. So I'm going to just hide these so they're not in the way so much. And the eye level, again, is really important here because this is the eye level of the point of view in the painting. So when you're placing things on your horizon, depending on how far you go above or below is going to kind of determine the height or the perceived height of those objects. And we know that these objects here, these trees, are taller because they go well above our observer's eye line here. And of course, we know that these posts here that are off to the side, off to the right, those are perhaps not quite as tall as the person who took the photo or the person or the point of view in the painting that we do. So very important things to consider here. Now, there are three fundamental properties of perspective. The first is convergence. The second is foreshortening. And the third is diminution. So what these are convergence is when things get further away, they begin to kind of converge. If you can see in this example here, these trees kind of have an outline, and you can kind of tell where each tree is, but at a certain point, they all kind of start to really smash together and just become one big clump of trees because they're converging. Same thing with back here. The second is foreshortening. When objects are rotated towards or away from us, they can appear squashed or stretched. This is called foreshortening. Notice how the clouds in the distance are a little more thinner and squashed than these clouds that are closer to the foreground. This is because the clouds in the foreground are a little bit more overhead, so we're seeing a different view of them, and the clouds that are further away are more distant and turned at a different angle, so they appear to be a bit thinner because of perspective. And then diminution, that's everything shrinking down in scale as well. So while foreshortening is more of a compression from the top and kind of squishing, diminution is also kind of shrinking it in from the sides too and just overall making it smaller. For instance, and you probably can't see it very well, but there's a electrical wire pole here, and it's a lot smaller than the one that's a bit closer in the foreground. So it's getting diminished a little bit in size and made smaller. So you'll want to use all three of these properties here when you're painting your landscape, along with the landscape components that I pointed out just a minute ago. And that'll really help your artwork just look a lot more realistic. So the last thing we'll look at is the field of grass. And just like the clouds and everything else in a landscape, a field of grass is also bound by the rules of perspective. And it might be a little hard to see, but these blades of grass are all kind of lining up on this perspective point. If you look really close, you can kind of see it. It'll kind of flow in this radial pattern. They don't just go straight across. And if you were to draw the grass blades just straight across like this, you wouldn't quite get the same effect of perspective. They kind of have to be at this angle that follows the perspective. And they're smaller in the background, and they get bigger in the foreground. These grass blades are very big. You can see them quite well. And then the ones that are in the foreground, in the midground, and the background are much shorter. In fact, in the background, you really can't see any of the blades at all. The hue and the value of the grass also varies. The grass that is in the foreground is darker and is hue shifted more towards a cooler green. Dead grass, dirt, and vegetation of varying colors are mixed into the grass. Observe how the grass is not just a static green color, it also has some brown, yellow, and orange tinting to it. Now that we're familiar with some of the basic concepts, we're ready to get started on our first landscape painting. Remember to integrate the skills and knowledge you've learned from these warm-up videos while you're painting.